And the final third was told that it had already begun, this event, and so they needed to get there as quickly as possible. Now, they kind of did this with each person one at a time, and what they had done in between the two buildings is they had placed an actor whose job it was to act like he was in distress. And the story was that he had asthma and he had just taken some medicine. He was waiting for it to kick in. So as each student walked by, he would kind of cough and groan. And the researchers looked at the statistics of who stopped and who didn't. And some people did and some people did not. And when they crunched all of the data, they found that it didn't have anything to do with any kind of quirk of personality. And it didn't have anything to do with whether people were even thinking about the Good Samaritan story. The biggest predictor of whether people stopped or not was how hurried they were. The people who were in a hurry, who were told they were running late, stopped at a much lower rate than the people who had much more time on their hands. And they even talked to some of the students afterwards who said, you know, I was in a hurry and I saw him, and then I just kind of kept going, and it wasn't until 20 paces later that it really sunk in what was happening over here. But by that time, I was already kind of on to the next thing. And I have spoken to dozens of groups about this topic of Sabbath keeping, probably because I need to keep hearing it for myself. And I have shared lots of different kinds of ideas and lots of different stories and experiences, but I always start with the Good Samaritan study because it convicts me every time, and perhaps it convicts you a little bit too. Because this is, as Jesus taught us, what it means to love our neighbor as ourselves. This is the example he gives. And so this topic of Sabbath keeping, it's about finding rest in our busy lives. It's about balance. It's about letting God be God and not having to be the ones in charge all the time. But we do that because we are called to love our neighbor. It is not an end in itself. It is a means to greater faithfulness. And so that is really the focus of our time tonight. But the fact is, many of us live our lives like that third category, right? We maybe, if we're not always feeling like we're running perpetually late, we are maybe slicing and dicing our lives in such a way that it is just barely fitting. And I wanted to share a little video with you to kind of be a visual parable of what I'm talking about. And I hope that maybe you can relate to this a little bit. This is a little short video, about a minute long, called Rush Hour. And it is an intersection that has been creatively edited, as you will see. But let's go ahead and take a look and see what we notice about this and how it might resonate.
Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Taking a student that I've ever seen. You'll have nobody to call my own. Please turn on your magic beam. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream. Mr. Sandman, someone to hold. We'll be so busy before it's too old. So please turn on your magic beam. Mr. Sandman, bring me a dream.
Anybody need to take their blood pressure medication? Sometimes people see this, and occasionally a few people will say, that is great because nobody got hit. Everything just worked perfectly, right? And sometimes that happens in our lives, and it's just a beautiful gift of grace when we are in a hurry, when we're going, when we have lots of responsibilities and things happening, and miracle of miracles, it kind of all works. But it doesn't usually work that way. And I hear from a lot more people who say, oh, it stresses me out. And yet many of us live this kind of life where there is no margin. And that's what the Good Samaritan study is about, is we need enough margin in our lives to absorb the unexpected things that happen. There are always things coming at us. and how do we create a bit of space? And Sabbath is one of the ways we create that space. We could talk the whole rest of the time, we're not going to, about this idea of information overload, but overlaid on all of our responsibilities, all of the things we bring, that our work, our volunteer work, our family, our caregiving, all of that is this constant hum of information that is also always kind of around. And I wanted to just share a couple of statistics with you. Between the dawn of civilization, this is according to a former Google CEO, through 2003, about 5 exabytes of information has been created. That much information is created every 2 days. The majority of Americans absorb the equivalent of 174 newspapers every day. And probably my favorite, 48 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute. More than we could possibly ever absorb ourselves, and yet it is always around us. And we have to be very intentional about not letting that constant hum of data and information get inside us. It reminds me of many, many years ago. I was going on a road trip with some college friends. We had graduated and we were going on a trip from Texas to Virginia. And we had 2 cars, and remember CB radios, anyone in here? I'm kind of dating myself here, but we had 2 radios so we could talk between the 2 cars. This was pre-cell phones. And we chatted the whole time. This is like a 2-day drive from Texas to Virginia. And we were talking and chatting, and all of a sudden the driver in the other car said, "Hey, I need to sign off for a second." So we sort of were silent. We're like, okay, we were just kind of waiting. Did somebody say something to make him mad? What's going on? And I don't know, half an hour later, he came back on and he said, "It's all fine. I just felt like there were kind of too many people in the car all of a sudden." And I don't know if you've had that experience, but I have that experience a lot, where it just feels like there are too many people in the car. And what do we do in the midst of that? Because they're usually precious people to us. They're people that we don't want to neglect and forget. And this is where we were, my husband and I, many years ago, and how the book came to be is we were in that too many people in the car kind of mode. We were both working full time. We had 2 little kids, another one on the way. And as I said yesterday, or on Sunday with the Rector's Forum on Sunday morning, it felt like a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle with 600 pieces in the box. We were trying to figure out how to do it right. There's got to be a way to crack this code so that we can just fit it all in and make it work. Because other people seem like they're pulling this off, and I don't know how they're able to figure this out, and we can't figure this out. And we had a lot of churning about, what do we do about this? What can we do to make this a different kind of way of being, not only for us, but for our children? And it was one of those, what I call an aha duh moment, which is realizing that we had this resource right there in our faith, this gift of Sabbath, which I think, like a lot of people, we had sort of relegated to the past. This is one of those cultural things that we really just can't do anymore because we live in a 24/7 kind of world. And we thought, well, what if we really did take it seriously? What if we really tried to do this? What would happen? And so we decided, there were a lot of kind of year-long experiments going on, people writing about them at this time, and we thought, what if we just took a year and took this seriously? 1 day a week where we rested from our work. We either didn't do it or we did it at another time. What would we learn? What would change about our lives if we did that? And we figured we can do anything for a year, right? And if it's really awful, we can stop the experiment early. But a year, we felt like we could really dig into it. So like a good Presbyterian, and I think Episcopalians are similar, we love to study things. So I tried to find every book on Sabbath I could get my hands on. And there are so many wonderful books out there, and I commend many of them to you. But a lot of them talk about the why and don't really talk very much about the how. Especially because at the time we had, as I said, 2 little kids, another one on the way, and I didn't see anyone writing from that perspective. And I think the challenges with Sabbath are many, and it's true whether you are a single person, whether you're single with children, whether you're retired, whether you're an empty nester. The challenges are different, but the basic impulse, the basic need is the same. So I was looking for a voice that wasn't out there, and so I essentially wrote the book that I wanted to read, which a lot of authors end up doing, and that's how the story of Sabbath in the Suburbs came to be. And one of the things that I learned, and we'll talk a little bit about, we'll kind of move back and forth between some practical wisdom and also just some more theoretical, general kind of learnings, and then we'll have some Q&A for you all to help flesh this out even further. But there's a wonderful Lutheran pastor, Nadia Bolz-Weber. She is, if you know her work from Pastrix and some other things that she has written, she is quite irreverent. I really wanted to show you this video called No One Has It All, and I previewed it, and it has one too many F-bombs in it for me to feel good about showing it to you. So I am going to read a portion of it to you, because I think it really crystallizes something important about this topic of Sabbath keeping. She says, several years ago, like many women my age, I was trying not to disappoint my family, not disappoint my job, not disappoint my friends. I wanted to prove that I could have it all, and it was important to me that nothing get dropped. And if the occasional need for sleeping pills and Netflix and chocolate-induced catatonic states was the price I paid, then so be it. But as it was, she says, I decided on 6 days a week of CrossFit and an 8:30 p.m. bedtime. But that was the problem, she said. On the outside, my plan looked like good self-care, but really it was just a list of habits that I adopted to ensure that I could still overfunction. Until the day, she says, I seriously disappointed somebody that I loved. And their response was to say, that really stinks, although she doesn't say stinks. That really stinks, and I forgive you. Which immediately made me cry, she said, because I didn't need to have it all. I needed to be set free. I needed someone to say, Nadia, let the plates drop. Because the fear of dropping them was torturing me, and in the end was way worse than having them drop. And faith is the thing that tells me that I am already enough. Faith tells me that I am loved quite apart from anything I do or not do. Faith tells me that my worthiness is not in my busyness. And I share that story because Nadia is my sister. I can relate to what she is saying. And I think sometimes we come to this topic, any kind of spiritual discipline, whether it's prayer or Sabbath or worship or contemplation or fasting or whatever we want to take on, spiritual reading. And we do it as a kind of a self-care so we can keep on being just as frantic and busy as we were before. It kind of is like, let's just fill up our gas tank so that we can keep going 90 miles an hour. And I think what Nadia points to and what I learned, and I shouldn't even put that in past tense because I'm still learning it, is that Sabbath goes way deeper than that. Because Sabbath, for me, when it is really at its best, is about me realizing that my worthiness is not in my busyness. So it's more than just filling up the gas tank. So here are a few things. I know you all have been studying this and have talked about this in some small groups. Not everyone has had that experience, so I don't want to assume that you are coming with that perspective. But I want to share a few elements of Sabbath keeping to kind of help us build out a definition, but also give you some places to start. Because what we're talking about here is making the impossible possible. And one of the things I talked about on Sunday morning with the congregation is that we think we have to do it perfectly. And Nadia was trying to do it 6 days a week of CrossFit, 8:30 p.m. bedtime. It feels very regimented, doesn't it? It doesn't feel very gracious. It doesn't feel very responsive and flexible to the comings and goings of our lives. And so one of the things that I want to impress upon you all is that we just start where we start. And it's never going to be easy. There are times when it's harder and times when it's easier, but life is never going to just hand you the perfect opportunity to try this spiritual practice. And so it's incumbent on all of us to find those little teeny shifts that we can make to start wherever we start. And so here are some elements of Sabbath keeping. And as I said, they're very basic, but I hope maybe they can give you a little foothold into this. The first is the simple idea of rest and play. And I met for lunch with a group of moms today, and we were talking about this view of Sabbath. Some of us may have grown up with this, that Sabbath was a day to kind of say no. You're not allowed to do certain things. You don't work, but you also, generations past have told me, they weren't allowed to go to movies that day, or they couldn't even play outside in the front yard. It was a day to kind of be very quiet and still. And I want to expand our view of Sabbath and say that rest and play can be very active. And so Sabbath is not about doing nothing, especially if you have children. That just fills me with all kinds of anxiety to think about trying to get kids to do nothing for a whole day, or even for a couple of hours. That's just not the way they are, and that's not the way we are. And so think about this rhythm of rest and play. And play can be restful, even if it's something that is very active. And I put puzzles up there because we're kind of in a puzzle phase right now as a family. And I can talk a little bit later, maybe during Q&A, about how Sabbath shifts as families change. When I wrote the book, our kids were about 8, 5, and 3, and now we are 15, 12, and 10. It looks different now, and we can talk about that. The other thing that happened as we thought about rest and play is that we really moved. When we first started, we did a lot of field trips. We did a lot of outings, like trips to the pumpkin patch and kind of things that required other people to sort of provide the recreation for us. And as we got more comfortable with ourselves and with this practice, we went from outings to whatever the opposite of innings, but time at home where we really started to trust that we knew how to care for ourselves and we didn't have to be busy, but we could find little things that delighted us and pursue those. Another key element is the idea of frequency. And this is one that I think is really, really important. Now, what God lays out in Scripture is a weekly rhythm. So I put weekly if possible, because I'm like the Sabbath fairy. I'm not the Sabbath police. I want to grant you permission to find your way into Sabbath any way you can. And so if you come up to me and say, I just don't know how we can do it every week, then I want to say, well, what about every 3 weeks? What about every 2 weeks? The good thing about frequency is it takes the pressure off of each individual Sabbath to be the end-all, be-all experience that's going to completely renew and restore us so that we can go back out there into the world, right? There were many times when, you'll see a video later about this, me talking about this, but there's not like this hush and sort of choir of angels that happens when Sabbath is taking place. Your kids maybe are still kind of at each other, and you still have all the same stuff that you've been dealing with before, and sometimes that stuff takes over to the point that it doesn't even feel all that restful, but there's another one coming, and that's really key. And so the frequency of it is important. And again, find that frequency that works for you to begin with. I talked earlier about the kind of Sabbath as a time to say no, and how we want to maybe reframe that. And I really found great guidance in Isaiah 58 that talks about keeping the Sabbath as a delight. And I love that word, delight. Sometimes when I do multi-day retreats with groups around this topic, we start out and I want to know, what is something that brings you delight? In fact, let's just say, what is an activity not related to your work that brings you delight? Just call it out. Running? Me too. Love that. What else? Going to the beach, which you all can do so much easier than I can in landlocked Virginia. What else? Choir. Okay. Reading. Right. Movie. Yes. Here are the sources of your Sabbath, right? And we'll talk a little bit later about framing and how even the activities we're already doing can take on a different character if we frame them and say, this is my Sabbath. it makes a difference in what we call something. Borrowed this from the Carmelites, this slide from their 2015 emphasis, but it was perfectly illustrating what I want to say, which is that Sabbath is a day to fast from certain things and maybe also to feast on certain things. Fast from the things that drain our energy and drain our spirit and bring us further away from God and spirit, and feast on those things that really draw us close again. So for those, I don't know if this is true of you all here, but living in Northern Virginia, there are people, my neighbors, who have very, very long commutes. And so I say maybe Sabbath is a day that you fast from driving. And you may be at home doing a little bit of housework and puttering around, but the fact that you don't have to get in the car and fight traffic, that fasting function can make a difference. And maybe that's a little place to start, and you build on it from there. And then feasting. If you are working in an office all week, breathing recirculated air, feast on the outdoors. And if you love to garden, some people would consider that work. I consider it work because it doesn't bring me delight. But for those who do find that delight and you're kind of stuck in a cubicle all week or whatever, feasting on just being outside and breathing fresh air is another way to bring a different emphasis to Sabbath. Community is really important. I found myself really envying the Jewish community because they have this whole infrastructure in place for how to make Sabbath happen. And the whole community, they may not all be practicing it. A lot fewer than 100% of Jews practice the sort of strict Sabbath as we think about it. But the structure is there, and the ethos is there. And so they can keep one another accountable. I remember when I first got interested and we were really immersing in Sabbath, the congregation I was serving was doing a similar emphasis to what you all were doing. And we had what we called the Sabbath Project, where we had people get together for an evening meal. And we said, okay, for the next 8 weeks, we are each going to practice Sabbath, however you define it. For some people, it was an evening on the weekend. For some people, it was a whole day. For some people, it was just a couple of hours on Wednesday night, because that was the time they had carved out. For one family of 5 with 3 teenagers, their Sabbath activities was that they were all going to walk the dog at the same time on the weekend. And I remember the mother saying this to me. She's like, this is our commitment. And she said it kind of sheepishly, like, this is all we can manage. And I said, this is great. This is where you start, right? And she came in a couple weeks later and she said, I have to tell you, our dog, when we had kind of been at each other, that day, and we were like, okay, it's time to take Holly for a walk. So, I got the leash, and Holly saw me with the leash and of course was excited because she's a dog and she's excited. But then she sees, oh my gosh, you're here too. And you're here too. And she just kept jumping, like, they're all here and they're all going to take me for a walk. It was just a beautiful moment of togetherness. And that was where they started. But anyway, there were several people who came up to me, and I wished, of course, I was such a Sabbath evangelist at this point. I was like, oh, the whole congregation needs to do this. Why isn't everyone participating in the Sabbath Project? And I know why. I mean, it's hard sometimes to even visualize or turn your schedule on a dime to make it possible. And one of the parents came up to me and said, we just couldn't figure out how to do it right now. But there's something about knowing that you all are doing it, which has already had a spiritual impact on us. And I don't understand what that is, except maybe there's just kind of a spiritual herd immunity that happens, Like sometimes I'm falling short, but I'm relying on you to sort of be there with me as well. And then there'll be times when you need me to stand with you. And so that community is really important. I know I'm one of the last words on this topic before you kind of move on to the next subject, but I hope that you all will keep that accountability for one another. Because did you know, here's a little fact, that if you set a goal for yourself and you just kind of keep it in your mind, you have about a 6 to 8% chance of fulfilling that goal. Not very good. It increases to 30% if you write the goal down. But if you tell another person about the goal, it increases to 60%. So if this is something that you care about and you want to help take hold in your life, Tell a friend and ask them to ask you about it in a couple of weeks. How is it going? And be accountability partners for each other. That's really important and really helpful. Think of Sabbath as a time for attentiveness. This little quote is from Daniel Goleman, who writes a lot about children's emotional intelligence, and he wrote a book called Focus. And in an interview a few years ago, he said, attention is a form of love. He said, think about it. Empathy, paying full attention. You're not going to have rapport with someone unless you first have full mutual attention. And if there's a topic, an activity, a cause, a mission you love, you're going to be fully engaged. So the connection between love and attention is very, very important. So I think another element of Sabbath keeping is just paying attention to what we're paying attention to, right? And often we are paying attention to a lot of different things. Pinball brain, anybody else? Can I get an amen? And so whatever we need to do during that little swath of time to let our attention be where it needs to be will help us. And the final element that I love, this phrase comes from Abraham Joshua Heschel, who has, of course, written one of the great books about Sabbath. But he says, the Sabbath is not just a date, but an atmosphere. And I think maybe some of us have probably had that moment where there's just there's a shift. Even when maybe you're in the midst of some activity, maybe when you're even at work. Ooh, how can I imagine that? But there just feels like an atmosphere of flow, like everything is happening as it kind of needs to, and you can't force that. And my experience is that you set the date and you set time for that space so that you can recognize the atmosphere when it happens. And the atmosphere happens sometimes and reinforces how important it is to have that date. One more little element of Sabbath before we get into a little bit of scripture. This is a wonderful resource that I commend to you. This is a group of Jewish artists called Reboot, but they have come up with what they call their Sabbath Manifesto. And their mission is to bring the practice of Sabbath to the modern world. And they have come up with these 10 principles, which I think are lovely. And let me explain what that picture is. Part of what they do is they have what they call the cell phone sleeping bag. So for those of us who need a little visual reminder to put the cell phone away, you just put it in its little, tuck it in to its sleeping bag. So here are the 10 principles. Avoid technology. I've had groups who have reframed that to say, use technology faithfully, because many of us face time with loved ones across the miles, and maybe we don't want to avoid it altogether, but we want to think about how to use it responsibly. Connect with loved ones. Nurture your health. Get outside. Avoid commerce. That's a big one in the Jewish tradition, to try to just step off of the whole production and consumption hamster wheel. Light candles, drink wine, eat bread, find silence, and give back. And that give back, again, connects with that Good Samaritan story, right? We don't do this just for ourselves. We do this to be more faithful in the world. And I will also say, if you all are interested, that the Sabbath Manifesto folks have an initiative every March called the Day of Unplugging. And it's a big social media kind of thing where they want people to post pictures of what they're going to do. Of course, if they're unplugged, they're not actually on social media. So beforehand or after, to encourage whole communities to do this. So like Friday night to Saturday, just put all of the technology away and unplug. So those are some elements of Sabbath. And those flow out of where we see Sabbath in Scripture. Let me check my time here. Okay, we're good. There are 3 main places. This is a little bit of a review, but I think it's helpful to help us kind of find the container for where this Sabbath stuff comes from. The 3 places are the story of creation, of course, the story of liberation, and then resurrection. Creation, really quickly, of course, God creates over 6 days or 6 periods of time, however literally you read that story. But however you read it, at the end there is a time of rest. God creates the Sabbath day, and the rhythm is established. It's not just a rhythm of creation, it's a rhythm that God enters into as well. God rests on that day. And so that pattern is established for us. The second story is the story of the people of Israel coming out of slavery. And I think for Christians, we really kind of lean on the creation story. And I think for most Jews, where they really enter into Sabbath is this idea of liberation, that they were slaves in Egypt to Pharaoh. They did not have agency and license to not work. They were slaves. They did not have that freedom. And so when God brings them out of slavery, God gives them the gift of these 10 commandments. And right nestled near the middle is that fourth commandment, the commandment to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. And they do that not just, again, so that they can recharge and get back out there. They do that as a testimony that we are not slaves anymore. We are free people. So it is a declaration as much as it is a practice. And I think that it would behoove us as Christians to lean into that story a little bit and think about Sabbath as a declaration and not just a practice that's good for us and helps us rest and renew. To say we are not slaves to expectations, we're not slaves to the economy, we're not slaves to the need to give our kids the perfect experiences so that they get into a good college and they have a good life and all of those sorts of things. And we'll talk about that more in a minute, but let me address the third one, which is resurrection. This is a little less obvious place where we see Sabbath, but Dorothy Bass, who has written about Sabbath, says we see this in the story of the first day. Jesus was raised on the first day of the week, which was also the first day of a new reality. And so when we lean into this practice of Sabbath, we are participating in that resurrection story where we are new people. It is a new world that we live in. And that's where she sees Sabbath at play in the resurrection story. But back to this story of liberation. This is a really tiny print. I won't read the whole thing to you, but I wanted to lift up this story, and maybe you can look at it later, because I think this is a place where we can maybe enter into thinking about why this liberation is so important. This is a story of before the plagues, before Moses has been, before any of that, they have asked Pharaoh for a few days to go celebrate a festival in the wilderness. And Pharaoh just bristles at it. He recoils. He says, "Who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go, even for a few days? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." And then they try to appeal to him again, and he says, no, go get back to your work. And here's the key. It's kind of in the middle there. It says, Pharaoh continued, "Now they are more numerous than the people of the land, and yet you want them to stop working." And that same day, Pharaoh commanded the taskmasters, give them even more work. We used to give them the straw to build the bricks. They need to find their own straw now. So he reacts to this by buckling down and doubling down on more work. And he does that because he is stuck in an anxious system. It says it in the middle. They are more numerous than the people of the land. He knows that they are powerful. And if they rose up and said, "We don't want to do it this way anymore, we will overthrow you," that they have the numbers to do that. So it's this cycle of anxiety. And I feel like we are still in that cycle of anxiety. I tell the story in the book about my oldest daughter was in about first grade, and they changed the bus schedule for the route, and the kids were getting home later, and all of the other parents mobilized, and they had petitions. They're like, "We need to get them home earlier so they can get their snack, and then they can get the Cub Scouts and whatever, differential equations, whatever they're doing, so all of this stuff." And we were doing it too, right? But they put so much energy into it, and they finally prevailed, and they convinced Fairfax County Transportation Services to change the bus route so the kids could get home earlier, and they were getting home 4 minutes earlier. And I didn't get hooked into that, but I did get hooked in realizing that there are also things that I get that way about. And it is that cycle of anxiety of wanting to be a good parent and wanting to give my kids opportunities so that they can go on to a good college and get a good job and have a good life. And that cycle of anxiety is still very much with us. We've internalized it, and it takes its toll. It comes at a cost. And so I think it would behoove us to lean into that story as a source, an inspiration for Sabbath. That anxiety is really filtering into all kinds of places. I don't know if you all saw this article from a year or so ago with this very, very alarmist headline. But it had some interesting statistics in it about this anxiety that is also filtering down into our kids. I told the congregation on Sunday, quoted a anxiety specialist, Richard Leahy, who said the average high school kid today has the same amount of anxiety as the average psychiatric patient in the 1950s. And this is something that Jean Twenge, she wrote this article for The Atlantic. She said, 8th graders who spend 10 or more hours a week on social media, which is really not that long, 10 hours a week. I mean, that's like about an hour a day. But they're 56% more likely to say that they're unhappy than those who spend less time. And those who spend 6 to 9 hours a week, so a little bit less, are still 47% more likely to say that they're unhappy than those who use it less. Kids are going out together less. I'm sorry, it's my magnetic personality. I'm making the microphone short out. 12th graders are going out less often than 8th graders did in 2009. Kids are not getting together with their friends. This has impact. It has impact on their anxiety levels and their ability to cope in the world. And so I don't want to say that Sabbath is a corrective to that. It is one element that could help stem that tide. And here are just some quick reasons why children need Sabbath. Children need time to play. It's very basic. This is how children learn. This is how children grow. Sabbath gives children a chance to be a little in charge. You have to do that in an age-appropriate way. But one of the things that really benefited our family was to give the kids a chance to say, well, what do you want this day to look like? And we learned a lot from that. And they discover their temperament. They discover what they need. If they are peopled out, I think my kids kind of learned whether they were sort of introvert and extrovert at a relatively early age because they had this a gift of Sabbath to say, what do I need right now? Oh, I need to be by myself for a while. Or, no, let's go out and let's be with friends or invite friends over, or that kind of thing. This is a hard one, but they learn that their parents have limits. And that is an important lesson for them to learn, that we too have to stop and recharge and renew. It gives us a chance simply to enjoy one another, right? To not always be going and, I said to somebody in preparation for this that I felt like our third kid's first words were going to be just a minute, or maybe hurry up, right? One of those two. And so just a time of enjoyment. And also, we're living in a time where the church is becoming less and less we're losing, I think, successive generations. And I don't know what that is all going to shake out, but I do know that Sabbath, wherever my kids end up, and I hope they will remain in the church, but I hope that Sabbath is a spiritual foundation for their lives, regardless of where they end up. So I'm going to pause here and let me just check okay. I want to show you a quick video, and then we're going to get into some really brass tacks of suggestions for places to start. And this is called Cathedral. And after the book had been out for about a year, we filmed a series of videos to sort of reinforce some of the themes of the book. And this one we recorded at the Washington National Cathedral. So we're going to watch that and then just get into some suggestions and then have some conversation. The Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel has written one of the definitive books about Sabbath, and he calls the Sabbath a cathedral in time. And we are here on the grounds of Washington National Cathedral here in Washington, D.C., where that metaphor becomes very real for me. But when we think about a cathedral in time is not built with bricks, mortar, stained glass. It's built out of minutes and hours. It's built over a lifetime. And we're here in one of the busiest cities in the entire world. We're here on the grounds of the cathedral. I can hear cars rushing by. In Washington, it's not unusual for people to honk at each other in those cars. There are buses loading and unloading. There are leaf blowers. There are lawn mowers. And yet when you walk inside that cathedral, everything changes. You walk in and it takes a minute for your eyes to adjust. Your pace slows down. Your breathing slows just a little bit, and you can wander. You can behold the beauties of this place. When my family and I began a Sabbath practice, I had this idea that once we started Sabbath, we would enter into that practice, that space, and all of our worries, all of our anxieties would just melt away. And we would be bathed in this kind of holy light and holy space. And it just doesn't work that way. Even in this beautiful cathedral, I'm still thinking about the things I need to be doing. I'm still thinking about people I'm worried about or concerned for. Those things don't go away, but when you're in that cathedral, those worries and those anxieties take on a totally different character. You're in a structure that's reliable. You're in a structure that's sturdy enough to hold all of those anxieties and worries and concerns, and they take on a different character. And they don't become this thing that nags and gnaws at us. The structure is strong enough to hold all of that. And we think about physical cathedrals as these really permanent places. Many of them are centuries old, and the National Cathedral is about 100 years old. But they're always changing. Our own cathedral was damaged about 2 years ago from an earthquake, and so there's scaffolding behind me right now where they are working on the tower to repair it. There's always change going on in the cathedral. People come in and volunteers put out fresh flowers. And pilgrims and wanderers and tourists come in and light a candle and say a prayer. The place is changing all the time, just like our Sabbath is always changing. And so my question for you is, what kind of cathedral in time are you building with your life, with your Sabbath practice? How are you building a foundation, a cathedral in time with the way that you live and the way that you rest and the way that you play? Let's tend to that how a little bit. Here are just some suggestions and wisdom that I have gleaned myself from my own practice and from others and leading these kinds of groups. And they are simple but not easy, as most things in the spiritual life are. The first thing I would just simply say is to schedule it. Get it on your calendar. It's not something that is going to happen on its own without intention. And for most of us, that means setting aside time and actually putting it on the calendar. And again, if a day feels insurmountable at this point, you start with an hour. You start with what you have. We are not, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, as someone said at lunch today. And I think that's really, really good wisdom. The second thing to do is to reframe something that you are already doing that is good for your spirit, and see what happens when you reframe that as Sabbath. And I mentioned this to the group Sunday morning, but Ellen Langer is a social scientist who has studied this impact of language. And she has two different studies. One, she asked people to look at comic strips and sort of evaluate the messages in them. And she told half of the group that they were working at doing this, and the other half that they were playing. They were reading comic books and comic strips. They were doing the exact same activity, but the people who said they were working didn't have as much fun as the people who said they were playing at this activity. Again, same activity. Similarly, she did a study of women who clean hotel rooms, chambermaids, we used to call them, but they, half of them were told, talking about their work, hauling around those huge carts and vacuum cleaners, and the other half framed it as exercise. And the people who framed it as exercise actually had better physiological outcomes than the people, again, doing the exact same thing, but blood pressure, other things actually were better, were stronger with that labeling. And so what we're doing, if you have family time, if you have something that is a practice of that brings you delight, see what happens, see what changes about the experience by that language. We believe in the power of the word, and the word can change the impact of what we are doing. So you are inviting God into that in a different way by calling it something else. Another way to enter into this practice is just to, if you do nothing else, maybe just think about your technology use and how could you do things a little bit differently. And the research is extensive, and I won't get into a lot of it, but there's a couple of things I want to highlight. One is that when we read a book on paper, we use a different part of our brain than when we're using a Kindle. The Kindle or iPad or whatever your reader of choice is, it encourages a more, I don't remember what part of the brain, but it encourages a more scattered kind of way of reading than when we read on paper. Not that we want, sometimes we need to do that or want to do that, it's convenient, but just think about that attention is love thing and what that Kindle brain can kind of, how that can get in the way of that. The second thing is they did a study, I think this was at UVA, in which they had people have a conversation, and they had half of the people with their cell phones on the table in front of them and the other half the people without. And the people with the cell phones on the table, even if they weren't talking on them, reported a lower level of satisfaction with the conversation than the people who had put away the phone. So just having it there is that reminder of the outside world. So just think about that, just something to consider. Another suggestion is just, we get off kilter, and so Sabbath can be a way that we get re-kiltered. I think I made up that word. But I tell a story in the book about my husband who, one November, we were having Sabbath, and I was doing something with our daughters, and Robert was out with our son James, and he came in. And I said, "What have y'all been doing?" And he said, "Oh, I built a little rack for our firewood so that we could have it on the back porch, and it would be just kind of easier to access. Just a little thing," and he showed me. And I asked him later, I said, "Now, again, I'm not the Sabbath police, but that does sound like work to me. Like that, I would consider that work." And I'm curious, you obviously didn't. He said, "No, because he works in IT. He's a software product manager." He said, "I am in meetings all week. I am on my phone, I'm on my laptop, cajoling engineers to get their work done. This puts me into a completely different part of my brain." He was getting re-kiltered, right? He also said, "I didn't have to go to the hardware store," so that helped too. It really was a restful activity. We talked about this too, is just thinking about our lives, living them Sabbathly. Remember how I said that Sabbath isn't just a date, but an atmosphere? So can we think about our lives as opportunities to encounter God, even when we are in the midst of the busyness? We can do that with distraction, we can do that scattered, or we can try to bring that Sabbath mindset even into the messiness of our lives. And the last thing that I would say is just to give up on perfection. In addition to being a writer and a speaker, I also am a ministry coach. So I work with a lot of pastors and helping them set goals, and many of them are working on self-care things. And in coaching, we talk a lot about these 2% shifts, these little changes that we can make in our lives that end up having a big impact. And so we don't need to make radical changes tonight. If you're feeling nudged to this, you will have more success probably if you find one of those 2% shifts that you can then build on. It's like New Year's resolutions, right? I'm going to lose 20 pounds. That's a huge goal. But if you say, today I'm going to eat fewer carbs, that is a doable goal. So let yourself off the hook, like Nadia let herself off the hook, just to be human, not perfect. In fact, I want to close with a story, and then let's open it up to some conversation. You may know what your own triggers are that sort of tell you that you're working a little too hard, that you're holding on a little too tight, and you need some space. One of mine is when I start to get things wrong in my calendar. Like I think something starts at a certain time and it actually starts at a different time, or I have an appointment that I've totally forgotten about. Those are my signs that I'm holding on a little too tight. Several years ago, I was serving at church. Hang on, I'm losing my microphone. We were having a service for wholeness and healing, and the service was due to start at 7:30. So I got in my car about 6:30, 6:35, about 20, 25-minute drive to get there. And I don't know how I realized this, but during the drive, I realized that the service actually started at 7, not at 7:30. And I'm looking at the little GPS going, I'm going to get there at 6:58. Okay. So I called the elder who was going to be assisting me, and I said, I am so sorry. I had 7:30 in my mind. I know it starts at 7. I am going to be there right as we're, so I gave him some instructions of, the anointing oil is in this drawer and all of, sort of the preparations that I was planning to do. He's like, okay, it's fine. The organist is here. And of course, it was one of those where we had a bunch of visitors. I mean, sometimes not many people come, but of course that night there were all these new people. But, he said, that's fine. We're just going to play the organ. It'll be very meditative. It's fine. And I was not ready to let go of that. I was so just disgusted with myself, I guess, to be perfectly honest. And I was just like, I'm so sorry, Dana. I am just so, and I really wanted to say disgusted with myself. How could I do that? And he said, you're human. And as far as I was concerned, I had already been to the service for healing and wholeness, because that was what I needed to hear. I am human. We are all human, doing the best we can. And so I just want to leave you with that you are worthy right now in your franticness or in your desire to do this and you don't know how to even make it happen. You are enough. And I would love to open it up at this point to some conversation and see where your heart is on this. And Catherine's going to be my Phil Donahue to give another retro example from the past, that and CB radios. I'm really showing my age here.
Yeah, let's go ahead and use the mic rather than shout out. I think so everybody can hear. So does anybody have any questions? Then I'll run around with the mic. I might start with my own. So I work on Sundays like you used to every single Sunday. So for me, I've tried to incorporate a Sabbath that is maybe more Saturday than Sunday for our family. But for other families, how do you think about worship as a part of their Sabbath experience?
Yeah, somebody brought this up on Sunday because, especially if you're trying to get kids out the door and, find socks, maybe they're matching, maybe they're not. I mean, it's sort of, that kind of franticness really makes it difficult to have that be a restful experience. And that's something I think that people need to kind of just assess for themselves if that can be if that can be done Sabbathly, as Sabbathly as possible. Then that may be something that flows from getting to worship, and then afterwards you kind of can have a couple of hours, or if you can, the rest of the day to sort of just be in a different space. For some people, I mean, if you're singing in the choir, or if you have a meeting after church, that may not be the place that you start. Worship is an important part of Sabbath keeping, and it felt a little strange to have our Sabbath separated from the service of the Lord's Day, which is so central to who we are as a Christian community. But we were so Sabbath deprived that we felt like it was more important that we have a day than that we have it coupled with the worship experience. But I can't remember who it was at the lunch today was talking about, she had hit on it was lasagna. She made a lasagna ahead of time so that when they got home from church, they could just kind of pick at it the rest of the day and sort of have, not have this kind of production of a dinner, which puts a lot on often the mother in the house, but not always. So finding little tricks and quirks that can make that work is also a worthwhile thing. And it's a lot of trial and error too. My children are older now, so that frantic search for socks isn't quite as fraught as it used to be, and so worship can feel like more of a Sabbath experience than getting people all out and on time and all of that stuff.
I was just going to add to that because that was me at lunch.
Yes, thank you.
And I did it this Sunday too, and I noticed because my kids are really little. So it's enjoyable for me to actually put on nice clothes and take a shower. But my kids look a mess on Sunday morning. And it's because I'm done. I'm like, just put on Crocs, wear your jammies. I don't care. And yes, that was me. I looked nice. My kids were a mess. And then we ate lasagna all day.
Yes.
It was lovely.
I love that. I think that's so beautiful. And that, I mean, again, give up on perfection. You know, I mean that in a sense of don't feel like you have to do it perfectly, but also you're here and your kids are, I mean, they're fed and they're clothed in something. I mean, that to me is a win. So a lot of that, you know, the sort of performative aspects of our faith, we need to let go of a lot of that and just be real with one another. So thank you for helping lead the way. And I'm sure your kids are adorable no matter what they're wearing.
Very cute.
So, thank you for that. Yes.
Have there been any studies of the long-term effectiveness of the practice of Sabbath over long periods of time?
I am not familiar with any, but I would think that there would have to be probably more in the Jewish tradition, or perhaps Seventh-day Adventists who take it very seriously, their Saturday Sabbath. But I have not heard of that.
Yeah, there's for parents in the room, there's a great book by Lisa Miller called Raising the Spiritual Child. I'm going to get that wrong, something to that effect. But it talks about the impact on the well-being of children of just nurturing their spirituality. And this is such a countercultural message in this community when we want the very, very best for our kids. So that we want to do not just play softball, but do travel softball and every opportunity they can do, they have to do.
Yes.
And I often think about, you know, what the end game. We do know that when we pay attention to our children's spirituality, that their well-being is affected. Yes. So we can guess whether or not our kids are going to play softball in college, but we know that the outcome is better for our kids when we pay attention to this part of their lives.
Well said.
I just wish I could give a crystal ball to some families who, you know, whether it's Sabbath or worship or whatever the attention is to that part of our kids, that in the end it's so life-giving. And it's not a protection from the hardness that comes, but it's paying attention to the part of them that will help them be resilient when those hard things come. So
I was just going to use that word resilience because I think that is a real key to it. They learn to manage their own boredom and their own just mental moods. I mean, that is a huge thing in itself. And I'm not going to say my kids do that perfectly. They still, you know, can I get on the iPad? Can I get on the iPad? Can I play a video game? You know, but they also have learned to, in fact, we're dealing right now, our oldest is 15 and she's taking a lot of, because we're in it too. I mean, you know, the activities, and she's taking a lot of IB, she's in the IB program at her school, and she feels that very intensely and gets very stressed out and wants to have great grades in every single class and perform well. And we realized, I was just talking to my husband about this, she's very reluctant to do homework on weekends. The classes are set up that I don't think there's too much work. It's just you're going to have to do a little bit on the weekends. And my husband and I were laughing just a couple hours ago. He said, she's really internalized that rhythm of rest and Sabbath on the weekend, for better and worse. So we're going to have to figure out how to protect that time, which she really needs and she really values, and she's lived with it the longest as the oldest child. And now we need to find our way into that. And what does that mean for her academic, her performance, and for her mental health and all of those things. It's not easy stuff.
As I'm listening to you and you talking about your children really needing the Sabbath time, how did your family manage to convey that to other families, like their friends who may not be practicing? How does that work?
We did not, you know, I get that question a lot, and because they were younger, we had a little less of that explanation to do because they didn't have as many activities, and even, I mean, there were birthday parties and things like that, and because we like to follow the spirit of it rather than the letter of the law, we would allow those kinds of recreational things. It's not like it's Sabbath, you can't go to a birthday party. And so that interpretive work was not as much of an issue as I expected, frankly. With some families, we were explicit, and other times we just said, well, we're doing we have some family commitments. And so you can kind of find your way into the language that really feels natural, because it is countercultural. And sometimes that feels a little like too much to sort of say, well, we're in a Sabbath. But people understand family time, or they understand, why we're not available at this time. So it wasn't as much of an issue as I expected it to be, but it wasn't as much.
So you did it as an experiment for a year at first, right?
Yes.
So as you went through that year, what did you notice about your children that changed first?
They didn't really resist it. And I think but they didn't kind of understand it. They also really liked it, because that meant that they would have their parents more of their undivided attention. And so they really went with it. But they also, I think, part of it was that they also, as they mature, this happens, but they needed less direction from us. We saw them become more comfortable in their own skin to not need to be entertained. That didn't mean that we didn't play with them, but they were coming up with the ideas and the inspiration, and they got into the rhythm of it. And I remember one of the times we went to downtown to look at the cherry blossoms, which is a wonderful tradition in the spring in Washington, D.C. And we were all cranky, as happens, because again, it doesn't bathe in the holy glow, like I said in the video. And Caroline was in a really bad mood, and we ducked into the Arboretum, or the Botanical Gardens, I guess, near the Capitol. And it's like all the crankiness just drained out of her. And she said to us later, 6, 7 years old, however old she was, she said, "Mommy, I learned that the green growing things really help me relax and feel like better." And I told her grandmother, my mother-in-law, for whom she is named and who is an amazing gardener, I said, "She got that from you." But she learned it about herself. So that self-awareness was really an amazing thing. So, yeah.
I have 2 teenagers, 13 and 15. So obviously they're not going to be very receptive.
Yes.
They have a good spiritual background. I mean, they study the Bible every day in class. But like, any suggestions?
The first suggestion that I would make is, and I think I may tell this story in the book. I went to a parenting workshop many years ago, and they asked us to name all of the qualities we wanted our children to have at age 21. Like, imagine your children grown. What do you want them to have? And so we named all these things, and and I told my husband that later, and I said, "What do you want our child to have at age 21? He said, "Their own apartment." It's like, oh, that's good. But we named all these things, and the instructor said, "Okay, that is your list. That is what you work on in yourself. You want them to have an ethic of service, you build that into your life. You want them to care about other people and have a good social network, you work on that in yourself." So that is the first thing I would say, is that you will not just lead by example, which is part of that too, but it is also, you are in a different space by saying this is important. I wouldn't write off the idea altogether. There may be a way to kind of back your way into some, you may start calling it family time and say, well, this is also, known as, and you can, your own children to know how they would resonate with that. I have a friend who, one of the things that can help is to enter into their activities. So she said, when her daughter was in high school, she said, I would offer to her, she would want to learn how to knit, so I would teach her how to knit, or she wanted to bake something, so we'd bake something together. And a way for it to be a shared experience is that we'd listen to her music, like we'd each have an earbud in each of us would have in one ear. And she's like, I hated her music. But it really meant so much to her that they were sharing this experience, each contributing something to it. So I would say maybe as a first step, I mean, what do you need to do to embrace this practice if it's feeling like something that's tugging at you and you want them to know about it? But also just be really attentive to those openings for you to have. I know, I mean, my oldest is 15 and she's in that pulling away phase. And I have to remember that she's also still needing me to be close, even as she's pulling away. So my heart goes out to you. And it is a different kind of calculus when they're teens. I give these talks and workshops, and especially when my kids were younger, the parents of teens would come up to me and go, "You'll see." And now I see. So start where we can start and do what we can do. So.
I think for mine, Trish, my kids are 12 and 15 too.
Yeah.
And I think I've heard from some of our moms in our moms group, and they've reminded me how sometimes those requests to play and do Legos again and tell that story again, that it can get heavy when your kids are little.
Yes.
And then when that goes away, you forget. Like now my kids are at this age where if we suggest a card game, they are all over it. They love it because it's so novel to them that we would put our phones down and say, you know, let's play this goofy card game or whatever. It's been good.
Yeah.
And I think too, like for those of you with teenage boys, like sometimes that's the way, like the one-on-one eye contact conversations are really hard with like adolescent, well, not just boys, but any, you know, it's just a hard time of life, right? Yes. So we're just finding in our house that it's a great way to connect. That's not about like serious conversation connecting, but it's like we're, you know, playing the Wii or whatever it is.
And I find Sabbath is a good leveler because we're not doing it because it's good for them. It's something that we all need. And I find that kind of disarming when I am having conversations with my older children that they, oh, wow, you struggle with stuff too. And it's not that I'm not the parent, I'm not their buddy, you know, I don't kind of subscribe to that, but I'm also a human being. And I'm teaching them how to manage stress by managing stress in the ways that make sense to me. So that's, I mean, it's a good question and an important consideration. So,
well, if there aren't any more questions, I just want to thank MaryAnn for her visit with us this weekend, for all the wisdom she's given us. And I think, speaking for myself, it's been a really neat journey to be in this topic for quite a while, so that we really are reaching as many of our parishioners as we can, and also just kind of giving ourselves time and space to kind of let it soak in and see how we might be changed. So let's give MaryAnn a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, and I would just thank you all for all the ways you've participated in this Sabbath part of our lives together. We are Sunday after next going to be entering into Advent. Can't believe it's happening already. And no, actually, that's not so. The 25th is not the first Sunday of Advent. We are doing Advent reads that day, so it's going to feel a little Advent-y, but the first Sunday of Advent is actually on the 3rd. And as a quick note, we'll be doing prayer stations, Advent prayer stations that Sunday during the formation hour. So I encourage everybody to come to that. It's an intergenerational, bring your kids, all ages. Really neat event that we did last year for the first time. Right. So thank you for being here. Thank you, MaryAnn.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
And y'all have a good night. Thank you.
Yep. And I'll be glad to chat with you further over at the book table. Yes, so Remington mentioned, I'll just say really quickly, that the book that came out in May is called God, Improv, and the Art of Living, and it is about improvisation as a spiritual practice, what we do when life does not go according to plan. And in some ways it grew out of the Sabbath work because Sabbath is messy, and it doesn't always go the way we plan for it to, and so it sort of flows from there. But if you're interested in that, you can get it on Amazon. But yeah, so I thank you again for the chance to be here, and the Lord be with you all as you move into this next season and put a close to this one and hopefully have some ideas for how to incorporate this practice. It is called God, Improv, and the Art of Living. And it proposes 7 principles for tools for better living improvisationally, even for those of us who love the plan. And I do love the plan. I write as someone who's who comes from that perspective. But life is unpredictable and messy, so we need some tools for it. So that's what the book is. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful evening.